Hi everyone, I'm Jeff Rose. I'm a shareholder at Lyons Gaddis in Longmont and a past president of the Boulder County Bar Association. The purpose of today's presentation is to do a property insurance primer so that our BCBA membership is able to go in and talk to their friends, their family, their colleagues, anybody who might be calling post Marshall and Superior Fire with questions about the process, with questions about what's going on with my insurance carrier, or how does this work. I want to start by talking about the scope of the presentation. I'm intending this to be a presentation for attorneys only. Now, some of you are probably rolling your eyes saying that's a total CYA. It's actually not. The reason for it is property insurance claims are driven by very specific terms of each individual insurance policy. And the reason I say that I'm intending this for attorneys is because I want this to help the lawyers in our membership and in our community to be able to identify issues and go in and look for the specific provisions in a policy so that they can more accurately advise their family and their neighbors and their friends who are probably starting to call like crazy with questions like, this doesn't seem right, or I talked to my insurance agent and. So it's not a CYA, it really is everyone needs a lawyer looking at the individual policy. And that's why we're intending this presentation for our membership lawyers only and not for the general public. One illustration of that. You get a call from somebody, they say, I'm insured by Farmers. You look at the Farmers letterhead. Farmers letterhead usually says Farmers Insurance Group of Companies or something like that, and some twist on it. Farmers is an insurance exchange. They have over a dozen separate policy issuing companies under the umbrella. As crazy as it sounds, every one of those Farmers umbrella of insurance carriers that starts with Farmers is issuing a property insurance policy with slightly different terms. And the difference might make a very big change or have a very big impact on the ultimate result for the person who's calling you with questions. So that's why I say this is for attorneys, this is for issue spotting, this is to help ask the right questions so that you can get into the policy and advise anyone who needs help better. The number one piece of advice that you need to be giving to anyone who calls and asks you questions about, I've got insurance, this is what's going on, what do you think? Number one, you have to advise your clients, or anyone who's calling for that matter, that they need to get their specific policy and have counsel review their specific policy under the facts of what we're experiencing right now. So that to me is the bottom line. Always, always, always get the policy for that particular homeowner and have a lawyer read and analyze that particular policy. Seems simple, but that is typically where things get off on the wrong foot. The second thing where things get off on the wrong foot is most insureds, most policyholders, when they have a claim, they contact their insurance agent. What people don't realize is that now, and when I say now, I really mean in the past 15 years, your insurance agent is an independent insurance agent. And you'll catch that now that you see all of the Allstate ads on TV or the State Farm car driving by. Every one of these agents that our friends and clients and us we're dealing with, every one of those people does not work for the insurance carrier. They're our agent. They are not the insurance carrier's agent. In the good old days, you used to buy your policy from an agent who was working for the carrier, and then you'd go to your agent and say, you've been collecting dividends off me for 20 years. You got to help me. The carrier's being unreasonable. And they would go and they work for the carrier and they'd pressure the carrier on your behalf. And the insurance carrier, as you can imagine, got a little bit sick of that. So the person that's selling you a policy has no control over the insurance carrier for the most part. The exception would be if you're buying direct from a company like Geico, who does a lot of online sales, or Insurance or Progressive. But when people talk about contacting their insurance agent, they are not talking about anyone that has any sway with the insurance carrier. And the people, the policyholders, have a very hard time understanding that, because what we hear is my insurance agent, they're an Allstate agent, they're a State Farm agent. Not really, it's sales. Third area that I want to talk about very briefly before we get into the policies themselves is an issue that not a lot of people are talking about, but I think is going to be a very important issue, particularly in Louisville and Superior right now. And that is, we're going to talk a lot about the insurance claim process, but what we're not talking about as much is homeowners associations and the architectural control that they have over how people rebuild. A lot of the neighborhoods in Louisville and Superior are covenant protected neighborhoods. And there is, in those covenants, almost always an architectural control committee. I'm sure many of you are on HOA boards. Every HOA board would love it to have a lawyer on, but call me skeptical. It's always that one person in the neighborhood who really cares about the color of your mailbox that is the president of the HOA Architectural Control Committee. And believe it or not, that person now has a lot of say over how a homeowner and an insurance carrier get to rebuild the house. So know that that's an issue. Know that that's a weird twist. Bottom line, if somebody's impacted by the HOA, go to the meetings or get copies of the meetings online if the HOAs are recording them. Get a copy of the covenants. They're recorded. It's a public record. They're easy to get. And take a look at what architectural control elements are going to be at play. Because everyone's focused on the money and the insurance cost of rebuilding. And just wait until 3 months from now. Houses start popping back up and you start hearing from the HOAs, nope, that doesn't pass our architectural control standards. So watch out for that. Rest of today's talk is going to be policy oriented. We're going to go through the nuts of how to get a certified copy of the policy, how long it takes to get an actually certified copy. We're going to talk a lot about a declarations page and what that really means. We'll go into personal property versus structural coverages and why that's an important distinction, because there can be tens of thousands of dollars that you would think are part of the structure that are part of personal property. And then we'll go into the process of how most carriers tend to approach the finances of this. Big picture, and a lot of us have seen this either firsthand or just through our clients, is what does property insurance really get you? You buy a house in the mountains. It's beautiful. It's a 10-acre lot. It's wooded. It's in a beautiful area. You love it. Your homeowner's policy basically covers the structures and the contents, and it doesn't cover the aesthetic value. It doesn't cover the neighborhood qualities. It doesn't cover any of the more intangible things that caused you to want to live in that area. In many cases, it also doesn't cover the aesthetic of the lot itself, which is why when you drive up into some of the scarred areas in the mountains right now, you see, number one, a lot of people have chosen not to return. And number two, you see a lot of people who have chosen to return, and you see a newly reconstructed house in the middle of a Martian-like landscape. The reason for that is often that people have to make very difficult financial decisions because the cost of walking away from that property can be very high. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. That's where you start talking about the actual cash value and things like recoverable depreciation. And then you see other people who financially have to rebuild because the insurance company usually will rebuild the structure that was there, but they can't afford to walk away. They can't afford to take that hit. So they rebuild and they have to wait out the regrowth of the area around them. Could work in the long term, 10, 20 years, but in the short term, it means that there's people who are actively living in places that are burn scars. When you think about it, it makes sense. The insurance carrier is insuring your structure. They're insuring the contents. That's really what the policy is about. They're not insuring your mortgage. So you buy a beautiful place in the mountains, it costs $500,000 or more. A big part of the value in that isn't just the structure, isn't just the land, it's the land and the structure combined in that beautiful setting. Your house burns down, the insurance carrier says it's going to cost $200,000 to rebuild the structure. They're happy to rebuild the structure, but somebody owes $350,000 left on the mortgage. They're very underwater, so they don't have much of a choice because the insurance company might say, we'll give you a check for $200,000 at best, and they're still left with a net mortgage obligation of $150,000 owed to the mortgage company. So these are pretty challenging financial realities that often drive people's decision to rebuild. I think we're going to be hearing a lot of people in Louisville and Superior and Marshall talking about maybe this is a good time to downsize. Maybe this is a time that we can get out of this house and go to something else. The financial realities of what insurance is going to actually pay for, what that check is going to be made out to versus what the mortgage obligation, I think that's going to be the primary driver on people's decision to rebuild and remain. Obviously, if you rebuild in 2 years from now when the area has generally recovered, you sell your house, that's a different story. But the mortgage is still there, and that is the big financial factor that a lot of people need to be looking at. Because just because your house burned down doesn't mean the bank says no problem. It might give you a couple of months of reprieve, but overall, that mortgage, that note, it's still owing every month, and you've got to make that payment. So be weighing what a client's wishes really are versus the financial realities of what a policy covers. Now, what does a policy cover? Step one for any lawyer is order a certified copy of the policy. A certified copy is policy that the insurance carrier stamps and says that we swear this is the policy that was in effect, this is the policy that binds us. That usually takes weeks for the carrier to issue. So what you do is first request a certified copy, and then in your request for a certified copy, whether it's over the phone, online, or you send a letter, also ask for an unofficial or an uncertified policy, because they can usually get you that one within a day and sometimes even sooner. Sometimes clients are able to download the policy directly for you. That's a great option. Doesn't hurt to get a downloaded copy for you to be taking a look at while you're waiting for the certified policy, and sometimes even get a downloaded copy so that you can start talking about the policy while you're even waiting for that unofficial copy. The declarations page is going to be something that's included with the certified policy, might not necessarily be included on the PDFs that your client can get online, but you need to get an accurate declarations page. Every carrier has very different terms. Some people call it dwelling protection, which is we're insuring your house. Then there's usually another category called other structures. Other structures could be an adjacent structure, a detached garage, a deck. Sometimes falls under the other structures coverage because it's not specifically within the dwelling. Shed, if I haven't already said that. Sometimes even things like the swing set in the backyard can fall under that second tier of coverage called other structures or adjacent structures coverage. Get the policy, read the definitions for what this carrier is saying constitutes the dwelling or the home versus other structures. Tip for you, you might think you have a detached garage. The insurance carrier might think it's not detached because of an awning or a walkway or a fence, something that normal people would look at and say, oh, come on, that's not a connection, it's an overhang or a carport or something goofy like that. Little details like that can make a pretty big difference in how the claim can be valued and how the client can make a recovery. Imagine somebody has a heated, insulated 3-car garage and shop that cost him $200,000, $300,000 to build. If the insurance carrier considers that to be part of the dwelling, you might find yourself with a $300,000 gap in coverage just because there's an awning or a fence or a railing or something very small that makes a connection between what should be considered an outbuilding and the dwelling itself. So those are things that you need to be looking out for in the policies and the declarations pages. Many, not all, but many policies have a landscaping or a soil structure or a geotechnical element to coverage. That's usually a good thing. It usually covers sod. Sometimes it covers the sprinkler system. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it covers if there's a hill and you have to put up a retaining wall, things like that. It doesn't necessarily cover if you're in a wooded lot and the non-landscape section burns and you're just left looking at a scar. So look at the details for that in particular to see what the carrier is looking at as a separate part of coverages for just the ground. Another thing about HOAs, sometimes the HOAs cover that. So take a look at the policy, take a look at the HOA declarations, and see who might be responsible for not just maintaining the yard, but also doing the landscaping in those yards. Two more categories of coverage that become important. Number one, personal property. Personal property is all of your stuff. Personal property can cover a very wide range of things, ranging from your 10-year-old Levi's jeans to, in some cases, we would think your watch, your family jewelry, whatever sort of valuables a normal person would have in their house. Be careful when you're talking about personal property and read the policy about personal property, because sometimes there are riders that are necessary at the time the policy is issued for things like jewelry, artwork, musical instruments, things like that. It can make a very big difference. A lot of people get a policy when they are first-time homeowners and they live in the house for 15 years before anything bad happens. Every year they click renew on the policy. Well, at the time, they might not have owned any expensive artwork or jewelry or musical instruments or anything else that falls into that bucket of particularly valuable items. Insurance carriers get to say, sorry, that might not be covered. We'll help you replace your jeans, your clothes, the basics, but we're going to hold you to the necessity to take out riders for any pieces of jewelry over a certain amount, any musical instruments over a certain amount, any artwork, things like that. Final category that we're going to talk about is usually it's called additional living expenses, or ALE coverage. Most carriers are calling it that. This is something that covers temporary housing. It's usually a coverage that goes for increments of time. The policies are usually wording things so that you don't automatically get 2 years of rental housing in the south of France. They usually say we're going to provide rental coverage up to a certain amount per month for 2 months at a time, 1 month at a time. Sometimes you see policies just say we're going to do up to 2 years, but the carrier has some discretion. This is another important detail to look at and to understand the policy language for, because many people who are displaced by the Marshall and Superior fire are facing multi-year rebuild propositions. So when they go to look for a rental house on a temporary basis, they're not talking about a flood damage that's going to mean they're staying at a residence inn hotel for a month. They're talking about something that is going to be multiple years, or certainly at least 1 year, before they can even think about getting back into their house. Anyone who's doing that is going to be looking at rentals that are almost always on a 6-month basis or longer. Usually you're looking at year-long leases. So for this particular circumstance now in 2022, it might be a no-brainer for the insurance carrier to say, yep, sign a 1-year lease, no problem. And that is sort of a no-brainer. The problem is, a year from now, a lot of these houses might not yet be rebuilt. And the landlord for the rental house that the policyholder has been living in with their family for a year is going to say, it's time to renew. Here's another year-long lease. Get ready and prepare your clients for the reality that the insurance carrier might say, we think your house is going to be done in 6 months, so we're only going to authorize ALE coverage under the policy for that 6 months. And there's going to be a tension between the insured, who, number one, doesn't want to move again, number two, is in this impossible situation, and really nobody knows if the house is going to be completely rebuilt in 6 months. And a carrier is saying, you can sign a year-long lease, but we're only paying for 6 months. It's a little bit of a hardball element, but it's a reality. It's a reality that we're going to be looking at in December 2022 with a close eye. And I think a lot of people are going to be in that situation where the carrier says, I'll give you a couple more months, but the landlord for the long-term rental is saying, I need a year-long lease. Want to dig a little deeper into the insurance policy and some of the more technical terms that play into how people should be approaching this as a financial reality. Policies have a wide variety of language that they use to say what they're going to do to replace or rebuild or help you replace or help you rebuild. Some policies say just straight up, the coverage we provide is that we are going to cover the cost of rebuilding, period. Replacement value, pretty good. But then when you get into the details, they can structure things in very detailed ways depending on what contractor you use, what estimator you use, what kind of appraisal you might be using, and it becomes a very technical part of policy interpretation. One of the typical phrases is actual cash value versus replacement value. Policies will typically talk about replacement value versus actual cash value. And they'll say, we will cover your replacement value. But then they'll say, what we're going to do is issue you a check for actual cash value, which is different, and then maybe pay you the balance later. So here's how that works. You have a house that has 10-year-old custom cabinets. They burn in the fire. The replacement value is custom cabinets. You get to get your custom cabinets. That suggests new custom cabinets. So the carrier says, we are going to replace with custom cabinets of equal quality. That's what we're covering up to the policy limit. Check the declarations page for that policy limit. So go find your cabinet maker and get your custom cabinets. And you say, okay, great. Here's the cabinet maker's quote. And they say, okay, the first check we're going to write you is for the actual cash value at the time of the loss. That is a depreciated value. So they're going to cut you a check for whatever they call the depreciation. Call it 30% depreciation, could be more, depending on the age of the house. So you've got this invoice for $60,000 in new custom cabinets, and they're writing you a check for $32,000 and saying, go get your cabinets. And you think, what do you mean, go get the cabinets? You write the check to them. This is one of the really big challenges for especially catastrophic property losses, because the carrier says, all right, we'll give you actual cash value now, and we'll write you a check for what they call, and this is the phrase that you'll see, recoverable depreciation, once you prove to us that you did that repair. And they want pictures, or they'll have an inspection, or they'll do something like that, so that they make sure that they're going to write you the check for the actual cash value. Don't worry, they'll give it they'll give you all of the coverage just a little bit later. From a carrier's perspective, they're doing that because if you're going to take the insurance check, they're only going to write you a check for the value on the date of the loss. But if they're going to replace it, they want to make sure that you replace it. It seems fair on the surface, but what it means is policyholders might be in a position where they have to front a lot of money to rebuild their house to the specifications that they had before, because the carrier is saying, well, you're using your own cabinet maker or your own contractor, and that's totally fine. You have the right to do that. So here's actual cash value now, and here's the recoverable depreciation later. And when I say recoverable depreciation, check that policy term too, because if they depreciate something 30%, depending on what the policy language says, it's possible that they say there's a portion of depreciation that's non-recoverable, meaning you don't ever get that back, and a portion of the depreciation that is recoverable, so you do get that back. And sometimes that means if they owe you $30,000 in depreciation, they're only going to write you a check for a fraction of that. That's why the policy terms are so important. Another example. So we were looking at something that's easy to depreciate and that generally goes up. Cost of building generally goes up. Depreciation generally goes down. Two things to watch: personal property replacement value. For example, 58-inch big screen TV. You bought it 10 years ago. You have a 10-year-old TV. The actual cash value of that TV might be zero. You might have paid $1,000 for it 10 years ago, and the cost to replace that item now might be $300 or $500 or something like that. So the depreciation really matters in some areas, and it's to the policyholder's advantage, and in other areas it's to the policyholder's disadvantage. Another example, say that you have an expensive Rolex, an heirloom family Rolex. The 1944 Great Escape Rolex. And if anybody needs a break, go watch The Great Escape. It's one of my favorite movies. The actual cash value for a Rolex watch might be $10,000, but you might have that 1944 Great Escape Stalag Luft 13 Rolex model that's now worth $233,000 at auction. That's why people are generally expected by the carriers to get jewelry or art riders on the policy so that you can disclose this, have an appraisal done, all that stuff. But when you're calculating actual cash value versus replacement value, there can be a lot of swings and there can be a lot of changes depending on what we're talking about. On that subject of actual cash value versus recoverable depreciation, carriers can have very different preferences on how they want to do a claim that's a total loss. In this circumstance, where we're looking at catastrophic losses across entire neighborhoods, the carriers might be able to get basically bulk construction deals, not unlike developers who are able to get people who are doing 20 foundations all at once or 20 yard scrapes all at once. Carriers might have very strong preferences in getting people to use contractors who are doing an entire neighborhood all at once. So you might find that, in a neighborhood of 20 houses that were lost, there's 15 or 10 different insurance carriers who are involved, but they're all trying to talk to each other to find contractors who can get the work done and get the work done sort of in bulk. And they might say, we want you to use these contractors because it's going to go faster and it's going to be more efficient for everybody. Every carrier has different approaches. For example, Allstate has what they call a preferred list of contractors, which are contractors that they work with all the time, that they negotiate their own rates with, that they have their own deal with. Sometimes the carriers will say, if you go with our people, we'll pay them directly, and they'll just do the work. and you don't have to worry about actual cash value versus replacement value and recoverable depreciation, because we're going to send you to our pre-approved crew who's going to build it according to our specs. That can be effective. It can be good. The policyholders and the lawyers who are representing the policyholders need to be careful and need to watch those contractors, because those contractors get a lot of business from the insurance carrier. And if maybe I'm too skeptical, I think when the party that's paying you is different than the party that you're supposed to work for, I think the contractors have an eye on what Allstate wants, or what any insurance carrier wants, at least as much as they have an eye on what they should be delivering to their client, the homeowner. So there are a lot of ways that the carriers can approach this. The carriers can give you these incentives by saying, we're not going to worry about the financial side, we'll pay them directly to do the work. Just make sure that the policyholder and their lawyer together are paying close attention to the details of what's getting done, how it's getting done, to make sure that it's right, that it's fair, and it's in accordance with the coverage. It's not uncommon to see variation within the insurance carriers too. There's going to be a lot of different insurance adjusters who are assigned to this. You'll see some of the same names popping up all over the place, but you'll see a lot of new names who are assigned just because of the volume of losses here. There's going to be variation from adjuster to adjuster. There's going to be variation within each carrier and how they want to approach it on a subdivision by subdivision basis. So just because you think you've got a sense for how Allstate is doing it in one neighborhood doesn't necessarily mean that Allstate's doing it the same way in another neighborhood. Or, for example, companies like State Farm or Farmers, where there's lots of sub-insurance companies underneath the big umbrella of State Farm or Farmers. Policies issued under the Farmers Fire and Flood Casualty Company might be handling things different than under Farmers Casualty Company, things like that. So there's going to be a lot of variation. The bottom line is just keep coming back to your policy and to your declarations pages. Want to pause right now on the declarations page and why that matters and what people should be looking for. The declarations page is usually where they specify the policy limits, and it's normal. You should be expecting to see in almost every circumstance dollar amounts in some way. If there's not dollar amounts, they usually have a description of the formula of how they calculate what the policy limit is. But don't be surprised if you see a declarations page that has coverages that seem shockingly low to you. A lot of people have the right coverage. A lot of people pay attention to their homeowners policy coverages. But I would say a substantial majority don't. Most people buy a house, they get their coverage at the same time, and sometimes even through the mortgage or in connection with the mortgage. And then for a decade, you click renew, 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 renew. Just look at housing prices in Boulder and construction costs in Boulder County for the past 10 years. You buy a house in 2012, you could have purchased a property in a lot of the communities outside of Boulder for pretty reasonable prices. When you look at the declarations page on a policy, you might be shocked to see that the cost or that the limit for dwelling protection coverage is based off of a very old and very stale appraisal and a very old and very stale purchase price. So somebody could have purchased a house in Old Town Longmont 10 years ago for $300,000. That house could now be worth $600,000, and you might see the cost to rebuild based entirely off of that purchase price from 10 years ago. Good luck getting a contractor who can rebuild that house now for those prices. So there are going to be some surprises there. Personal property protection, usually there's a pretty round number in there that ranges between, a low one would be $10,000, a high one, I'm seeing them $500,000, sometimes even more. It's usually very inexpensive coverage because what we're talking about is insuring things like clothes, pots, pans, dishes. That can be a very difficult one to prove, and depreciation on those items can be a very cold reality. So as attorneys representing and advising policyholders, look to these declarations limits and look to them as a means of maximizing your coverage, not necessarily ensuring that every pair of jeans is replaced, because you're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort trying to justify the value of a pair of 10-year-old Levi's. And if you only have a $10,000 personal property coverage limit in the declarations page, your time and effort would be better spent just getting to that $10,000 policy limit through whatever means possible and not debating the value of a coffee cup. Other details on the declarations page, just watch where things are getting covered. For other structures coverages, a nice deck is a pretty expensive thing to build. It would, depending on what the declarations page says for coverages, it can be an advantage to have the deck be treated as an other structures, a non-dwelling specific coverage. But again, watch that compared to the nice fully heated and insulated 3-car garage with a shop or an art studio in it. Pay attention to what those coverage maxes are and work to make sure that you get to those maximum coverages in a way that works for the client faster, so that you don't end up trying to justify a $50,000 deck, but it comes at the expense of being able to build the garage. Those kinds of details and those kind of cost benefits are, I think, some of the more challenging things, especially when insurance coverage is limited. 2 more categories to cover. First, what are the steps that the homeowner needs to be taking? I'm doing this on December 10th, so we are a little over a week after the fire ripped through. Most people by now are either finalizing or about to finalize their short-term housing under their additional living expense coverages. Start there. Get a stable place for the people. Get them into a house that they can stay in, that they can go to school in, that they can go to work in. Sometimes the details of getting the internet connection are really important, but really difficult. So number one, you got to do what's good for life versus what's good for a legal case, and that is get into a safe and secure place where you can start living life again. Number 2, get the insurance policy and the declarations page and start reviewing them in detail. They're, as you probably gathered from this stuff about actual cash value versus replacement value versus recoverable depreciation versus non-recoverable depreciation, they're chewy. So as lawyers, review them, read them a couple of times, and start sketching out different scenarios of what goes where. Where does the deck go? How does that play into maximizing coverage? Where does the dwelling go? How is that defined under the policy? What kind of garage are we looking at? Is it detached? Is it an other structures coverage? Is it a dwelling coverage? Look at them relative to the policy maximums and start there as an attorney. From the homeowner's perspective, there is going to be an estimator or an appraiser or an inspector or whatever the insurance carrier wants to call it that needs to get on the ground and see the lot. Now you might say, well, duh, you don't need to see the lot. There's nothing there but ashes. No problem. Just know that very often they need to get that person on the ground to the site, even if it's just to see the foundation and verify the utility connections themselves. After that, you're going to be dealing with usually multiple insurance adjusters. Don't be surprised to see separate adjusters assigned for the dwelling, for personal property, for additional living expenses. You could have multiple assigned to each of it. You could see a team of adjusters working on things. There's lots of combinations. Just try to keep them straight in your own mind about what coverage and what part of the claim they're adjusting. The adjusters typically take an extremely detailed approach, and they're going to do that even in cases where the policy limits are woefully lower than what they should have been for that property. They're going to have this big computer-aided spreadsheet looking thing that's going to go through every room, every part of the structure, what type of shingle, what brand of countertop, what type of toilet is it. And if you think it sounds ridiculous, I mean, it does, especially for a total loss, but they're going to go through in that level of detail to determine what the insurance carrier thinks is the magnitude of loss. So knowing that, the homeowner and the homeowner's attorney need to do their own review. Start with pictures. A lot of people get those pamphlets about, like what to do when you buy a house, and one of them says, go and take a video of every room in the house. If you've got that, great. That's going to help you to document in minute detail what's the trim on the baseboards. Is there molding? What's the texture on the drywall? What's the thickness of the drywall? What kind of door handle is it? And when you imagine going to Home Depot to buy these materials, there can be a big difference in the finishes in a kitchen, the appliance line. I mean, all of these things really can add up and make a big difference. So what you want to do is, if you've got videos or pictures, use them. But go on room by room, break out every detail that you can possibly think of. Are the corners of the drywall bull-nosed and rounded versus just sharp angles? All of these things are going to make a pretty big difference in the final numbers, and you're going to need to be weighing that again against the policy limit. So that level of room by room analysis is going to be essential so that you can sanity check what you're seeing from the insurance adjuster, and that you can tell the insurance adjuster, actually no, there's a really big difference in the finish quality for what we had versus what you're talking about. The same thing goes with personal property. It's long, it's painstaking, it is annoying, but do a room by room analysis. What's in every drawer? What clothes? What shoes? What bathroom supplies? What kitchen supplies? What blinds were there? Try to be as meticulous and detailed as possible so that you can capture every part of this loss, because the insurance carrier is going to be doing something similar, and you can see big monetary differences if somebody just leaves out the blinds, or if a house in Superior or Louisville had a very high-end finished blind versus what they're speccing on the insurance adjuster's sheet. So go through all of those little details, weigh them against the practical realities of policy limits, and go forward that way. There is a category of person called category of person, that's the wrong way to word it. There are people who call themselves public insurance adjusters. These are folks, and don't be surprised if you see them flocking to Colorado right now from coastal states, hurricane impacted states, flooding impacted states, Tornado Alley, call it whatever you want, but these are groups of people who say they are an insurance adjuster who works for the homeowner. know that insurance carriers are extremely skeptical of public insurance adjusters. Any policyholder should consult with an attorney before hiring a public adjuster. I'm not saying all public adjusters are bad. I'm not saying that they don't provide a service. What I am saying is that there are bad ones out there, and they flock to disasters like this. Be wary, get good legal advice, be skeptical, know the carriers are skeptical. The credibility and the honesty in presenting an insurance claim is very important, because if somebody is lying about the contents or the what's included in their insurance claim, if somebody's trying to pull a fast one on the insurance carrier's remedy is to void coverage, and that would be catastrophic. So watch out for that, be smart about that, get good legal advice about that, and make sure that people know exactly what they're signing up for. I can envision scenarios where, especially on the personal property side of things, where it might make sense to have a public adjuster help with that process. But the second that it turns into puffing up a claim or trying to negotiate the claim improperly or present legal claims, there's a strong make sure everybody's staying in the right lane. Just like a lawyer shouldn't go in and try to be the contractor, a public adjuster shouldn't go in and try to be the lawyer. Be careful about that. Last section, remedies. What remedies does a homeowner have if their carrier is being unreasonable, if they're not getting what they think they're entitled to, if they're woefully underinsured, things like that? Number one, look in the policy to see if there are provisions for dispute resolution. The two things are an appraisal process. That's a formal process that insurance carriers like to utilize, where if there's a dispute about what should be covered or how much the coverage should be, they go through a formal appraisal process. Look at that. It might be a prerequisite before you can take any legal action. Also look at arbitration clauses. A lot of homeowners policies have appraisal and arbitration provisions in them. Sometimes the arbitration provision is if they both agree, they can go to arbitration. That's a well, duh. If anybody agrees, they can go to arbitration. But take a look, especially for that appraisal condition, and see how they make that dependent on arbitration or things like that. Because you might find that portions of coverage need to be submitted to that appraisal process, and sometimes even need to be arbitrated. So start there. Second part, the basics. We're in a contract situation. The insurance contract is a contract like any other. So there's breach of contract claims if any one person isn't abiding by their obligations under the contract. Colorado, like most states, implies the covenant of good faith and fair dealing in every contract. That's there. That's an option that people have. Bad faith claims, bad faith litigation. That's a very specific type of tort that a policyholder can assert against the insurance carrier when the insurance carrier is placing its interests above the interests of its insured. Carriers typically don't like it when you threaten bad faith, but that's the leverage that exists when an insurance carrier isn't putting their interests at least at the same level as the interests of their policyholders. There's potential for attorney fees for treble damages when you go into that world. So that's a pretty big stick. And if you're in that territory, make sure that you've got counsel who know how to do that, because there is a specific dynamic that comes with doing this regularly. And I think they're big enough claims and they're important enough claims that you need an attorney who really knows that area if you're in breach of contract and bad faith territory. Another claim that policyholders have is a statutory claim. CRS 10.3.1115 and CRS 10.3.1116. This is a statute that went into effect in the past 15 years or so. In a world of insurance litigation, it still feels a little bit new. It's not. It's a statutory codification of the long-term good faith and bad faith requirements. The statutes essentially say that an insurance carrier who unreasonably withholds payment or denies payment of insurance benefits is liable for 2 times that covered benefit. And there's a fee shifting provision in there as well. So it says the same thing that the old bad faith body of common law said, puts it in a statutory framework. And it is a big stick to yield against an insurance carrier. If you're going to play that card, play it smart, play it well, and make sure that the claim warrants it. And that's because the carriers, as soon as they hear that, counsel get involved. I mean, it escalates the level of adversity in these claims very substantially. But if you're in that territory, that group of statutes is very beneficial. It's very pro-policyholder, and it gets a lot of attention brought onto a claim very quickly from the carrier. Finally, underinsured status. We, as lawyers, are going to be looking at a lot of insurance policies where the homeowner is woefully underinsured. We've talked about this a couple of times in the past hour or so, but you are going to see $1 million houses that sometimes have dwelling protection coverage of $200,000, $250,000, something that as soon as you look at it, you think there's no way you rebuild that house for this price. You're going to think that's a crime, it's an atrocity, it's a tragedy. It's not a crime, but it's tragic, it's horrible. Colorado recognizes claims for an insurance carrier negligently underinsuring a policyholder. However, those claims are steep uphill. And the reason for it is Colorado law also presumes that every policyholder has read and understood their policy in accordance with Colorado law each time they renewed it. So if you go to the insurance carrier and say, no, negligent underinsurance, this is carrier, you screwed this up by not increasing the policy limits, the carrier is going to say, oh yeah? You know who screwed this up? The policyholder, because they read this and they consciously renewed it and they checked all those boxes online and they e-signed it saying that they've read the policy, they've reviewed the policy, they've done all of these things. So they put the blame straight back on the homeowner, and absent very compelling circumstances, the homeowner is going to have to live with that reality. I mean, we all check every one of those boxes and sign the thing each time we renew the insurance policy. So those claims are extremely difficult. Insurance carriers hate the threat or the thought of having to provide insurance coverage beyond the policy limits in those declarations pages. So anytime you start going, the tort of bad faith, the statutory claim, negligent underinsured status, make sure the case warrants that card, because sometimes when it does, you've got to do it. But if it doesn't, you're going to make the claim process a lot more difficult for your policyholder just by threatening those extra contractual coverage issues that carriers hate. I don't really care that the carrier doesn't like it, but it increases the level of tension and conflict in each claim, and sometimes it backfires if you don't do it right. Want to end on a point for our membership and for all of our clients across the board. Check your homeowner's insurance policy. Look at the coverages. Every time that you're talking to somebody about a real estate closing or buying a house or something, or estate planning or any of it, This should be a helpful reminder to us to go back and look at those coverages, because I suspect that many of us are underinsured. I suspect that many of our clients are underinsured. So it is always a good idea for us to go back, for ourselves, for our clients, for our staff, for everybody that we come in contact with. Review your homeowner's policy. Check those limits, make sure they make sense every couple of years. And also do that for your auto insurance policy, and for your umbrella policy, and for your professional liability policy. So kind of a well-duh statement to end today's presentation, but go back and look at those limits, because the number of people who are being impacted right now by not having nearly enough insurance coverage is frightening. Thanks, everybody. Be well, be safe, take care of yourselves, and hope to see you in person soon.